From the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I'm Stuart Patrick, and this is The World Unpacked. Last month, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its latest assessment report. The news is not good, which makes it somber reading on this year's Earth Day. Back in 2015, as you may recall, governments in Paris pledged to hold the rise in average global temperatures to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and ideally to less than 1.5 degrees. In fact, we're likely to blow past both goals, and the implications for life on Earth, including human life, could be dire. Beyond its immediate effects, scientists warn that critical components of the Earth system may be approaching tipping points and that crossing these thresholds could generate sudden and irreversible changes that themselves accelerate warming. Among the worries keeping them up late at night are the sudden dieback of the Amazon rainforest or a shutdown of the Atlantic Ocean conveyor belt that keeps Europe temperate. Given this trajectory, is there anything else we can do? Some scientists and policymakers are contemplating an unconventional approach to limit warming. It's called solar climate intervention or solar radiation modification. This would be a conscious effort to reduce the impact of solar radiation on atmospheric greenhouse gases by reflecting a minute portion of incoming sunlight back into space, sort of like a mirror would. In principle, this might buy the world some time, holding temperatures steady while humanity makes steady progress on reducing emissions and removing carbon from the atmosphere. Now, this may sound like science fiction, and in fact, it's appeared in some recent best-selling novels like Neil Stephenson's Termination Shock or Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future. But experts say that it's possible, and it might not even be that expensive. The idea, however, is very controversial. Critics worry that it could create perverse incentives, reducing momentum for climate action, as well as producing unintended consequences. It also poses some really tricky questions, like who exactly gets to set the global thermostat? Other people, though, are more open to the idea, particularly given the predicament we're in. They argue that its potential hazards need to be considered not in isolation, but alongside the very real dangers inherent in current climate trends. With us to help unpack these dilemmas is Kelly Wanser. Kelly is the executive director of SilverLining, a non-governmental organization devoted to promoting strategies to manage near-term climate risk. For the last decade, she's advocated greater U.S. and global investments in atmospheric science and has funded research on possible models to foster international cooperation on this agenda. In the interest of full disclosure, I should mention that Kelly was an unpaid advisor for a report I wrote on the topic last year for the Council on Foreign Relations. Kelly, welcome to the show. We're delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Stuart. I appreciate your inviting me on the show, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Terrific. Well, let's begin with the overall context. The fact that people are even considering this option would seem to suggest we're pretty badly off track. How should we think about the near-term climate risks that we confront when weighing our various policy options, including this one?
Well, I think some of the recent reports that you referred to in your opening from the UN about the projections for climate impacts in the coming decades. There's pretty dire projections now of things even by 2030 in terms of some of the impacts on people and on natural systems. I was recently at a conference in the ocean where there are some pretty big changes in the ocean projected potentially inside 2030 timeline. If you look at the projections for 2050, and I'll tell you why I'm sort of talking about these time horizons, then you get some really big potential displacement of people, fairly large loss of life, really big economic impacts from climate change. And one of the characteristics of, the climate between now and 2050 is all the projections have it continuing to warm, meaning that the portfolio of responses that we have today, reducing emissions, or even trying to pull greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, they don't work that quickly. And so one of the reasons that SilverLining exists and that we're interested in the kind of research that we are is to really understand the risk profile there, because in the current projections, a lot of people have nowhere to go. It's not safe. And so the question is, can we do any better than that? Because we've got big loss of life, loss of safety in the next few decades, and really significant damage, if not permanent change in natural systems. And so where we are is trying to say, what are the things we can look at to see if we can do any better than what's on the table now?
So right now, the world has basically three strategies for managing climate risk. The first is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the second would be removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, either through nature-based solutions like planting trees or sucking carbon out of the atmosphere with machines. And the third is adaptation, which is essentially making the effects of warming more tolerable. Why aren't those three enough? And would adding solar climate intervention to this portfolio somehow solve our climate change problem?
Yeah, so it's helpful. There are two kind of paradigms to think about that we found really helpful. One is like medicine. And if you think about a sick patient getting sicker, and you have things that you're trying to do to address like symptoms or the stability of the patient, and you have the things that might operate over the longer term to actually help the patient move back towards health. And the different responses to climate sort of mirror that, where there are things that might be helpful quickly that help alleviate some of the stress on the climate system and the natural systems. And there are things that operate over a longer time horizon, but are more relevant to the long-term sustainability of the climate. And so certainly reducing emissions, bringing emissions back down, in this case now really close to zero, is what you need for the long-term health of the patient. There's no replacement for that. The question is that enough? Like, do you have enough healthy system? Is it safe enough? And what it appears in the current projections from the UN, if you look at the curves, is, well, we have this warming that continues no matter how well we do that. And so like a sick patient is saying, okay, do we need something else to help improve the outcome of what's happening? And so then you look at carbon dioxide removal, which is like, can we bring those greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere fast to accelerate the process of, reducing warming and long-term health? And the problem is that we don't have very much information and almost no technology for doing that, which means we've got still quite a long time horizon for doing that process, and the scale of what you would need to make a meaningful difference in bringing warming down is massive. So we're starting from a very low base, and we need a very massive scale in a few decades or even sooner. And that's not really something that's ever happened in human history, because it involves activity in the physical world, which tends to take many decades to scale up, no matter what it is. So in that way, there's potential for that to be quite helpful, but there's a lot of probability that it's very unlikely to be sufficient for this kind of 3 to 4 decade problem.
So without getting too heavily into the technical details, can you tell us a little bit about how solar climate intervention might work in practice? Are there certain approaches or methods that are being considered, and have any actually been tried in the real world?
Well, the approach that scientists sort of landed on, when looking at the question in a sort of systematic way, what would be ways to bring trapped heat energy out of the climate system quickly, like within a few years if you had it. And so they landed on these processes that the Earth system, already has that regulate the temperature inside of it, which is the reflection of sunlight off of clouds and particles in the atmosphere. So, if you look at those pictures of the Earth from space, and the shiny blue dot, that's what that is. And the reason that they think that this is likely to be, something that you could feasibly scale and safely to some degree do is because they've seen it before. And so for anyone who's listening here, which is probably most people listening, who was born before 1991, they've lived through one version of this, which is when a large volcano goes off and it's big enough to push particles into the high layer of the atmosphere, of the stratosphere. Mount Pinatubo went off in 1991. It put some particles into the stratosphere. They stayed up there for between a year and 2 years and cooled the planet at its peak for about a half a degree Celsius during that period. And so that phenomenon is the one that scientists have looked at the most, which is, if you put particles in that outer layer of the atmosphere, a small amount of material can produce a big cooling effect. And that's happened before in a way that wasn't disruptive to people or natural systems. In fact, there was a recovery of Arctic ice. So that's been the top candidate way that if we needed to alleviate trapped heat energy in the climate system quickly, because we've really reached those critical danger points, that's the one that kind of scientists have put on top of the list to look at. It doesn't mean that most scientists think they know. It's very like medicine. Well, we have a candidate. Now we need to study to see, if this could be like safe and effective. And there are other versions of that in the lower part of the atmosphere that have to do with putting particles into the low cloud layer. And the reason the scientists think this might be promising is because that the particles from pollution, usually the dirty type of particles we're trying to get rid of for breathing purposes, those are currently mixing with the low cloud layer in a way that's making them a little bit brighter. And they're currently thought to be cooling the planet. So we're all living through this right now, just this very dirty, unplanned version of it. And so part of what scientists want to do is say, well, we've actually seen and lived through and experienced these dirty, unplanned versions. Are there cleaner, more optimized ways to do this for a while to improve the safety profile while we fix what else needs fixed?
So what is the state of the science regarding this? Do we know how the atmosphere would behave with these interventions, whether they're, in the stratosphere or whether they're in sort of low-lying marine clouds? And can we be sure that this will work based on models and limited experiments, or do we have to actually run a full planetary experiment to find out?
What we think the goal of research is to try to avoid a large-scale planetary experiment. With some odds that as things progress and get worse, people might try desperate things. And so the goal is, well, what can you do with research where the goal of the research is to be able to try to project forward what will the climate system do, warming-wise, and then what would these interventions do and compare them? And if the interventions start to look like a safer path, then what do we need to hone in on to really make sure? And so today, I would say the state of the research is very nascent. And there are two things that you need to research this, two broad sets of things. One is that you need specific research on the individual types of intervention, whether it's putting particles in the outer layer of the atmosphere, whether it's trying to brighten clouds in the theoretical case over the ocean, where the clouds are cleaner and the contrast with the dark surface is greater. So you need specific research on, generating kind of the optimum size and nature of particles that might be the best, safest way to do it, and do very small scale studies of the specifics of how those processes work so you can plug it into models. And so you've got to do that type of focused research on these specific approaches, as well as you've got to figure out what is the research and data that we need to do projections that we can be somewhat confident in of how this would play out over 30, 40, 50 years, both in the warming in the system, like in the unintervened system, and with these interventions. And what you bump into is that we have a lot of big gaps in our ability to project what the climate system is going to do in general. And we have big gaps in the observational data that we need to do these kinds of problems. And so we, in trying to say, well, what are the research needs? We didn't quite expect to find, part of what we need if we really want to do that problem well is a lot more observations of the atmosphere at all layers, and using those observations to improve the models at all layers. And that's something that we need for other problems, like what greenhouse gases are specifically going to do, and what different response paths that we might take, including removing greenhouse gases, might do. So we think that there's a really important big project for society to increase our investment in the observations and models in general, especially related to the atmosphere itself. And we need that to look at these interventions, and we also need it in general.
So as we discussed, the idea of consciously intervening in the Earth's climate system is pretty controversial. And last year, a global network of scholars published an open letter opposing public funding, not only for deployment of these technologies, but even for research itself, out of fear of normalizing this as a policy option. One of the big anxieties around this topic is the prospect that solo geoengineering could create what economists call a moral hazard, which is basically an incentive to do the wrong thing. In this case, that would mean reducing pressure for decarbonization and thus giving countries, consumers, and companies basically a get-out-of-jail card to continue their polluting ways. Is this a credible concern, do you think? And if so, how could we manage this risk?
Well, so you got a few things packed into your question there. And so I want to unpack it in a couple of ways. But one is really the question of separating research in these things from, the decisions about whether or not you're using them. And it's one of the reasons that we don't favor terms that use the word engineering, because it often confuses people that you're engineering something in the activity of looking at it. And the problem is very much more similar to a medical problem, because most of your research is atmospheric science and atmosphere and climate science. And so firstly, trying to have the conversation where there's this science we need to do to understand these processes of how the atmosphere behaves, to plug into models that will help improve our knowledge in general, our forecasting, and then understand these techniques so that we can make really rigorous, very hard-hitting decisions about whether or not they can be part of any portfolio. Ironically, I think when people dig into the research, as we've started to do, what you see is, well, there's a lot of potential that's interesting for reducing, the extremes of climate change, but these things have real limitations. And like medicine, the less you do, the safer they are. And so digging in and understanding them, what it doesn't tell you is that you can't reduce emissions. It actually really helps draw a bright line about the fact that, well, we've got the emissions level that we've got already in the system, which equates to this warming peak in 2050. And we really need to hold it there, and we might need these things too. So there's a way in which thinking about research, it has a strong potential to actually help ground in reality how people think about these things. And if you look at the comparison with what happened with carbon dioxide removal, there was the same argument against it, this idea that it would give people a get-out-of-jail-free card. And in some ways, we're seeing this play out a little bit now, where, there's a big push on carbon dioxide removal, and it's written in to the pathways as negative emissions, as a thing we're going to be doing. But we don't yet have the evidence base to know how that's going to work. And so from our perspective, we want to really avoid magical thinking about these things. If we don't research them, then, the idea that you could pull them out of your back pocket later starts to get really, creep in. So it's a little bit that there are two sides to moral hazard. I'm sympathetic to it because if we were in the 80s and having this conversation, then I would say, well, dialing down emissions over the course of time is the rational thing to do, and talking about these things and investing in these things is not. But now the risk profile is really high. And now we're talking about human life and sustainability. And it's different.
When we come back, I'll ask Kelly to share her thoughts about prospects for ramping up research efforts, both in the United States and abroad, and about what forms of international cooperation might be the most appropriate in this field. Hey, World Unpacked listeners. I've got a podcast recommendation for you if you're into all things Europe. Brought to you by my colleagues at Carnegie Europe, Europe Inside Out delves deep into the complex foreign policy challenges Europe faces, where the continent stands, and where it's heading. Check it out wherever you get your podcasts. So, Kelly, I'm curious about the role of the United States in all of this. You don't hear much in the media about the U.S. government taking action on solar climate intervention, and yet I understand that there's been bipartisan legislation and that the White House is actually on the hook to develop a U.S. policy on relevant research. Can you give us a sense of the latest on this policy agenda and who the actors and agencies are in the U.S. government that are involved in this?
Well, I think the conversation started in Congress a few years ago, and we were part of that, where, scientific assessments, well, actually, the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S. has done too, but the scientific assessments were sort of looking at the question of what these candidates were for more rapid interventions in the system. And so as that was emerging, there was this conversation in Congress, along two fronts. One, are these possibilities that could be helpful to public safety, to, global security? And then the question of, are these things that could be a problem? And are they things that we need to know about? Because at some point in the trajectory of warming, it gets more and more likely that someone would try to use them in better or worse ways, depending on how much knowledge there was. And so there was a pretty bipartisan agreement on the fact that being equipped to know and project what these things might do was in the interest of the United States and probably in the interest of the world. And it surfaced in that discussion that there's some very basic things that we didn't have that are precursors to that. Like we don't have currently a baseline of the chemistry of the outer layer of the atmosphere, of the stratosphere. That's your starting point to be able to project forward. If you put more stuff in the stratosphere, how dangerous is that? Well, we need to get that baseline. So part of the first step in the relevant agencies are really the agencies that are relevant to looking closely at the atmosphere and saying, what are the basics that we need to get on how the atmosphere is and what the models can do with that, so that we could put ourselves in a position to project forward what this stuff would do. And the two agencies that were relevant to that out of the gate were NOAA, which is the agency that handles our weather and a lot of the atmosphere. And they're one of the only two agencies that looks at the stratosphere. The other is NASA. And so it was NOAA and then the Department of Energy, which does a lot of research on the low cloud layer. And so they started down the path of saying, what are these gaps and these specifics that you need to do these problems? And it turns out that those gaps in these specifics on the stratosphere chemistry and processes, the low cloud processes, those are really gaps that needed filled anyway. And so there's a lot of agreement about that. And so there have been modest steps forward in those agencies to expand the research. It's very dual purpose to look at those kind of questions. And then there was, Congress said, look, with these interventions, we want to understand what it would take if you wanted to be able to do a really strong assessment scientifically of what these things would do. And so they've asked multiple agencies in the federal system to develop a report that would tell them, this is a research agenda. If you wanted to do a really strong assessment in 5 years of how these things would play out. And that's pending. So, it's likely that they'll come back soon with that report that would say, these are the things you need to do. The United States has historically been at the forefront of environmental and climate research in the world. They have some of the biggest capacity in their federal agencies and institutions. And so, so the United States has, they're among the handful of places in the world that has the capabilities that you need to really work on this in a holistic way. And they're interesting in that they have the tradition of supplying their data and research openly to the international system. So if the U.S. undertakes this work, a lot of that information ends up in the international system for the rest of the world to look at, which is a quality that we like.
Let me talk about the international stage a little bit more. One common critique of solar climate intervention is that this would be a scheme foisted on the developing world by rich countries. Do you think that's a fair characterization? And what are you hearing when you engage with your counterparts abroad on this agenda?
Well, I mean, we work with a lot of stakeholders in the global south who are sort of at the front lines of what climate impacts are doing. And so some of the engagements that we have, and we have people from countries like Pakistan and India and Honduras in our team. And so some of the engagements that we have are really coming from the place of, what is the research that helps us understand better options for our trajectory? Because I live in a place that in 2050 will be underwater or will be dry from drought. And so, there's a fair part of, the global south is very diverse. So you have different voices coming from different places. The strongest resistance to the research actually comes from the global north. And so, especially in Europe and Canada. And so, there's going to be a mix of influences. But what we think is maybe really important with regard to global south stakeholders is, can we get their researchers, their own experts, close to the research so that they can advise their governments and their stakeholders what it means for them. And we have a problem right now where it's very difficult for them to do that with climate change itself. They lack money, computing. They have the brain power. They have really brilliant people, but they lack the capacity to actually do the science of, how does this stuff affect my region locally and the things we care about. So for this issue, that just sort of gets drawn in neon. Like our vision of the ideal circumstance would be you have research and evidence that people can look at and ask their own questions and do the math and the projections for themselves for their parts of the world and then weigh in. And, so that's what's useful about having an open research environment where people can look at data and evidence and have tools and money to ask the questions they want to ask, and then weigh in from a place of being as informed as they can be.
In autumn of 2021, the National Intelligence Council in the United States released its first ever report on climate change. And one alarming scenario it considered was that the possibility that individual countries might take matters into their own hands and launch unilateral interventions to alter the world's climate. That's a very different danger than what we find in emissions reductions, where the worry is that countries will do too little, right? They're going to be free riders on the effects of others. In this case, it's not free riders, but what some have called free drivers. That is, a country, let's say China or, Iran might, let's say it's facing an acute climate threat. It might simply decide to freelance. And you could imagine this creating all kinds of global tensions, countries accusing each other of doing this surreptitiously, maybe even coming to blows over this. From your perspective, is this a growing danger? And if so, how might it be muted?
Well, I think one kind of way to sort of watch for the signal on that is actually the growing efforts in weather modification. So there are lots of efforts in different parts of the world to, induce rainfall, and those are growing. And for a variety of reasons, there are 7 states in the United States that have active weather modification programs. The UAE has a $500 million a year research fund. China is notoriously at these big programs. And where they were sort of sparsely looking to improve snowpack in the West or, rain out prior to the Olympics, these are now they're scaling up because we have these precipitation management issues that people are facing. And they have the same characteristics. If you make them scale big enough, then they have the problems that these other things have of changing weather patterns and things like this. And you start to see a signal of countries are looking at this from their own point of view, China's point of view, UAE's point of view. And so, so stepping up to the global scale, in the geopolitical context, countries are always optimizing first for their own people and their own politics. And then what happens next? And as impacts get greater and greater and populations get demands, actions of some kind, then these things become more on the table. And what we found in some of the gaming around this, thinking around this, that if you're not engaged in the research to understand what these things are and people are stepping forward, it's very difficult to know how to respond. And so it's pretty likely, it gets more likely as the world gets warmer and warmer and impacts get stronger, that certain countries would move into this. One characteristic is it's not super easy or cheap. You need to go to the outer layer of the atmosphere is pretty specialized. It's overlapping with countries that have space programs. And generally, to project what these things are going to do requires big supercomputing capacity. So it's not everyone. It's expensive. It requires advanced technology, even to contemplate doing it, in a relatively sketchy manner. But definitely something that, the big powers should be thinking about, the people with the capabilities to do the research, to project what they should do, is really important to continue.
So that brings me to the last question here about how this all should be governed from an international political perspective. One of the dilemmas right now is that there's not really any international treaties that explicitly address solar climate intervention, and most international organizations have steered away from it. Do you think anything could be done at the multilateral level to build some confidence and prevent countries from going alone?
Well, we've really become, we came at that same kind of question from a pretty neutral place. My organization about 5 years old, and we talked to, policy experts in the international sphere. And what we did was say, well, what are the things that have been really successful in terms of environmental and political outcomes, and what are the things that have been less successful, and what are their characteristics? And if you look at something like the Montreal Protocol, and some of the really successful global efforts on the environment, one of their characteristics is a lot of scientific cooperation. And so actually, having more research and more cooperative research and strong international assessments of the science is a really good way to kind of tamp down conflict. And one of my colleagues, with a background in more the geopolitical side, is saying, there's a lot of conflict associated with misunderstanding and lack of information, and a lot of potential risk there. And so if you have scientific cooperation, then you have countries that can talk to each other at the expert level about what's happening. That's actually a good risk reduction factor. It's also really important for them to advise their politicians, because if politicians don't have their own experts to refer to, it's very hard for, substantive political agreements to be made.
Well, Kelly, we're at the end of our allotted time. You've done a tremendous service to us by sort of connecting some cutting-edge science and technical possibilities with one of the most important international challenges and a potentially existential threat to humanity that we should be thinking about during Earth Day. I realize we've only scratched the surface of this fascinating and tricky topic, which only means we're going to have to continue the conversation both here at Carnegie and in the wider policy community. In the meantime, thanks so much for being on The World Unpacked.
Thank you for having me, Stuart. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked, brought to you by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and please don't forget to rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Isabel Villegas and Clarissa Guerrero and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. Catch you next time.